So I've recently become more and more interested in how to expand beyond just watercolours. And in this video I'm going to be talking you through a few sort of things I'm playing with at the moment. You might have seen them before on my channel and of course elsewhere. For example, starting off a sketch with an Inktense watercolour pencil, which leaves you a texture behind and really has a fascinating way of interacting with your watercolours. The reason that these kind of things are fun is that they provide something extra, something that watercolours can't do. They are a lovely, flexible and easy tool to carry around. They're really cheap. And really just trying to explore new things, which I think is the most fun part of doing art, creating art. The idea behind this sketch, so it's a scene from Edinburgh, and is to try and get those clear kind of horizontal and vertical lines. There's very little perspective in this. There's a little bit of perspective in the chimneys, which we will try and grab with our ink when we get there. But what there is lots of clear horizontals and very strong vertical marks. There's sketches on Instagram you might have seen, a couple of really brilliant sketches who I think capture these kind of strong verticals really well. So if we have a quick look at Urban Sketchliner's profile, I'll link that down below in the description as well. You can see that she has an amazing way of using her ink pen to create this vertical hatching, these vertical lines. Simone Ridyard is another artist who has this amazing sense of perspective, but also those strong verticals. And on the smaller Instagram profile side, someone who really is underfollowed is Hare Lewin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But Helen has this really strong and just incredibly impressive line work. It's these kind of influences that, as I set out my sketch, as I use the Inktense pencil, I'm going to try and channel and try and sort of put onto the page. On top of that, I want to be able to layer my style. I don't want to lose me, don't want to copy other people. Not that copying is necessarily a bad thing, as long as you're recognising the limitations for your development, but I do want to explore these ideas. So today we're exploring that little idea, and we're also going to be playing with a little bit of mixed media at the end with some posca pens. Along the way though, it'll be ink and watercolours as per usual. I've got a new palette at the moment. I'm experimenting. It's a bit bolder, a bit brighter, a couple fewer granulations, but plenty of character. You can find my video about that here if you want to get an update on what I'm using in my palette this year. And you can also find a full sort of Skillshare class on how I developed that palette and how you, more importantly, could develop your own palette if you wanted to. With that, let's start sketching. All you'll need is a pen with some waterproof ink in it, be that a fine line or a fountain pen, some watercolours, and if you've got it, either a graphite pencil or watercolour pencil, to just start the sketch off and get that underlay, that under sort of skeleton going first. So here we are, we've got the reference up on the left, and you can also find this reference on my Pinterest. It's from Unsplash Premium, so I can use it royalty free for you guys to sketch along with me. As you can see, I mentioned wanting to focus on those horizontal and vertical lines. So I'm first finding the key horizontal and vertical lines that I perceive in the image. This is going to give me the kind of initial shape and structure I need to build everything else on it. Then these shapes that I'm finding, because this is always, for me, always about finding those shapes really. These shapes are those trees blooming out in front, which obviously form a really lovely border. And what you can start doing at this point is imagining how the colours are going to work. And you can immediately imagine having a contrast of lovely rich greens underneath all these sort of earthy, reddy browns making up the buildings. The only bit of perspective, as I mentioned, the only bit of perspective in this scene really is those little edges of the chimneys. So on the left hand side of the image we'll see more and more of the edge of the sort of side of the chimney. In the middle we'll see less and less. Then on the right we'll start to see more and more, except there are very few chimneys on the right. because we have these fun towers instead. You can see these vertical lines I've marked in. That's a really, for me, a neat way of identifying the points, the maximum heights of the towers, and how I'm going to build the triangles of the towers around what else is going on, really. So just by drawing in those tall vertical lines, we immediately have that structure ready to go. And there you go. Pop in a little triangle and ta-da, it's done. I should make a mention, of course, about the pencil I'm using. So this is a Derwent Inktense pencil. I mentioned in one of my newsletters and a few of my videos for Christmas, I basically said to people, just get me some colours of this type of pencil that you think are fun. I hadn't really used them much before. I'd used other forms of Inktense, but I knew it was quite vibrant, interesting, lovely texture. And so I've got a few colours to use, and I really enjoy sketching with these warm undertones as a initial sketch instead of a graphite sketch, which is a perfectly good way of doing this. Having that warm undertone kind of glows out from underneath everything else that we do. Another way to have fun and match this is then to use a blue pencil, which would neutralise to some extent with the red, or it would form a purple or a neutral depending on exactly which hue of blue and which hue of red you're choosing. And you can get really lovely effects as soon as you add your water. Moving back to what I'm actually doing on the page, hopefully you can see now I've just started to find a few small shapes, and there's lots of small shapes for all these windows. For me and my style of art and how I enjoy sketching, I don't need all of these shapes. And you can see by just drawing horizontal and vertical lines, I'm getting those shapes in. I'm not having to actually draw the square, I'm just matching up my lines. Similarly, we've got more complicated windows in some places, and I'm just forming them out of matched up sort of parallel vertical lines. So it's a very easy process which doesn't take too much intelligence or frankly skill, just a little bit of understanding, and suddenly we can find all of these sort of parts of our scene. It's a really lovely way to sketch. If you have a scene like this which lends itself well to this kind of almost grid-like sketching, it's a lovely way to sketch. It doesn't feel over tight, it's quite quick, it's good fun, and it makes you simplify. Having done that, don't want to overdo it, don't want to get too stuck into the pencil work, so I'm just going to grab my pen. My pen is a Platinum 3776 for those who are interested in the exact pen. It's got an ultra extra fine nib, a bit like a 0.2mm fine liner. And inside I have platinum carbon black ink. Now all of these things are on my website, so if you go to urbansketch.co.uk or sketchloose.co.uk, you'll find supplies tabs. There's also a link in the description. The reason I mention all that is because, number one, the ink I'm using is waterproof. So that means when I wash away with the colours, I wash away this red pencil, the ink will stay where it is. So we'll be left with this kind of glowing red behind this black ink. I also mention it because using a rather fine pen will give me a lot of opportunity to add details without it becoming cartoonish, without it becoming too blocky or too sort of illustrative and flat. So a really fine nib lets us have a bit of fun. You can see, although I'm being inspired by a couple of amazing artists here, I'm also wanting to use my normal technique. So I'm linking everything up. I'm mostly doing this in a continuous line. But the structure underneath gives us that kind of clear, more defined format than I would normally achieve if I was just going for this. If I was just wobbling around the page like normal, then I wouldn't get this defined structure. Equally, hopefully you can see my lines aren't exactly following the pencil. One challenge with drawing with pencil first, and one of the reasons I don't often draw with pencil first, is of course that you can end up just tracing over your pencil marks with big bold pen marks. Everything becomes stilted, a little bit boring, loses that spontaneity. That may not be a problem you suffer with, but it's definitely a problem I suffer with. So for me, I like to try and purposefully keep loose, try and purposefully remember those pencil marks are a guideline. They're not there to sort of rule me or instruct me on exactly what to do, and I can move things around. And broadly speaking, if I do move things around, it will probably end up being more fun and looking better than if I just stuck with my initial pencil marks. So all the while we're just wandering around the page, finding little shapes, finding big shapes. Sometimes making lines a little bit bolder, and that's the advantage of a fountain pen. You just press harder, you get a bolder line, just to make sure we've still got that structure. And trying not to be too scribbly as well. There's a sort of concept I keep meaning to do a video about, which is this idea of economy of line. And one of the biggest challenges I see from artists on my courses, for example, is having a loose style but actually making your marks do something. So we don't want to just scribble, we don't want to try and draw a window and make it loose by drawing it 15 times, because it doesn't look loose anymore. It looks sort of, again, blocky, it looks overdone, it looks like we made mistakes. So trying to make sure our lines are doing something for the image, be that connecting things, be that adding texture. We just need to understand each line we're doing. And that's not to say I understand every line I'm doing. Things go wrong, and that's great, you know, it means we can always learn. But increasingly I do feel I'm getting to grips over the years with making my lines sort of purposeful. Each line is actually doing something. Even if it looks like it's wobbling for no reason, it's filling a little gap, or it's connecting things which just need connecting to make sense, or it's adding a little bit of extra value. So it's a challenging thing, I think, to learn about, but something which is worth thinking about as you're sketching next time. Perhaps just think, do I know why I'm doing this line? And if not, perhaps you don't need that line. See what happens if you reduce the number of lines in your sketches. So with that, you can see me wobbling around, and not everything has to be totally continuous. I want to come up and I want to get these towers, these spires in, and I'm just going to jump up to them, because there's no point in pointlessly connecting everything up. I'm down the bottom of the page, so I don't want to draw a pointless line. You know, that's not sticking to those economy of line principles, is it, if I pointlessly jump all the way up and draw a line across my page? So as well as, you know, trying to stick to some ideas, we have to be flexible in our processes and understand when our processes themselves need to flex so that we can achieve the outcome we want. Here I'm just going over a few bits. Notice this is quite ink heavy. For me, there's a lot of things going on, and to some extent you lose a little bit of that clear structure. So I'm trying to just redefine some of those clear horizontal lines, some of those clear shapes, so that we get that structure back underneath or above all the wibbly wobbly sort of scribbly nonsense that I've been doing and enjoying. And then the last little bit that we can do with our pen, or the last bit for me today, is to find some of that kind of value. If you look at the reference, you'll notice some of the windows are rather dark, some of them have got perhaps shutters on or something else making them very light, some of them will have reflections making them light. So I'm just picking out a few windows to add some very gentle hatching to get that feel of varied light and dark. And similarly, we've got a roof or two that we can see, and just giving it some extra textural lines. They're both adding texture, both telling us a little bit about the roof and the kind of material it's made of, but also picking it apart from the house. So just notice with those very simple marks how suddenly that roof really does stand out from the flat frontages of the houses around it. Similarly, a tiny bit of extra value on the left hand side of these spires will hopefully make them feel a little bit more 3D, which is one of the big aspirations we normally have in our art, to avoid it being a kind of 2D cartoony feel. Hatching has lots of uses. So down here in the front, I'm doing bigger, broader hatching to stop the front feeling so flat, make it feel like it's in different layers. So having different areas either white or slightly increased in value just simplifies things, pulls it apart and gives your image something extra. Notice how all the hatching is reasonably consistent. That's quite important when we're doing things like this, to make it not attract the eye too much. And again, so it feels like economy of line, so it doesn't feel like we've done lots of unnecessary marks or unnecessary scribbling. So here, I'm going to do all my painting today, or at least the vast majority of it, with this size 10 round brush. And you can see as I put on that first drop of water, there's that slight reddish tinge. That's coming from, of course, that red pen that I was using. This is my new watercolour palette, new for 2024, which is, for me, very exciting. I've not done a major update in a few years, actually. And this major update came about after I sort of realised I was using a few colours which might not be the best for the environment, and so great excuse just to have a bit of fun. So instead of my normal cobalt blue, that is an ultramarine blue sky, a little bit of manganese blue hue, which is a colour I used to use a few years ago a lot, but for some reason just fell out of using. And I also added some lavender, a lovely opaque colour. Here, coming in the front, that's a bit of graphite, so graphite grey. It's, again, just really quite a nicely textured, fairly flat, little bit of granulation, I think, but nicely textured, very neutral colour. It really does feel like a graphite grey. It's also got a good punch. It really does hold its weight. So just with a small amount of it, you can really see there's some significant shadow on the page already. This is some Mars yellow now. So Mars yellow, a lovely ochre colour. To be honest, I can barely distinguish it from ochre. And why am I using this, not ochre? Well, because I have it in my box of colours, because I thought it sounded interesting when someone was offering to send me a few colours to try out. And it's a really lovely colour, but if someone can tell me the difference between it and yellow ochre, then I'll be a very happy man. Amongst that, sort of to get that golden glow, that's why I've used that Mars yellow, and amongst that what I'm adding in is some mixed greens. So this is azure yellow mixed with the various blues in my palette, ultramarine, manganese blue hue, and using those sort of various tones and the very varied greens we can get from just a couple of colours, we can hopefully just build up a fairly complicated feeling set of trees. We've got a lot of negative space behind, and this is what I was talking about at the beginning, as we were segmenting off those trees, segmenting off the sort of area below the houses, starting to imagine how the colours might form a nice border. And this is what I had in my head, forming a varied, complicated but loosely washed set of yellows, golds, browns, greens, and letting the water do its thing as well, making sure there's plenty of water in there, plenty of linkages between the areas, so that these various things can, just create a bit of magic. And if you've seen my channel before, that's basically what my art is all about, is just letting the watercolours do something, and then I try and really take the credit. Here again, just introducing a few more linkages, just recognising that perhaps the houses could just look a tiny bit more interesting with something else going on. So dragging down a little bit of dripping colour, making some of these more bold colours stand out. There's a bit more graphite grey. I didn't mention at the beginning, and people do occasionally ask, do I paint flat or do I paint at an angle? It really depends on the effect I'm going for. And here I'm trying to link things up and get a flow down the page. So you can probably see my left hand is holding my block of paper up at about a 10 to 15 degree angle. That allows these colours to gently loop down. And you can see, for example, just on the right of the centre, do you notice that rather lovely bit of graphite which is trailing down? I just pointed it out with my brush. I mean, for me, that's the kind of thing I couldn't paint, and I think it just looks absolutely fantastic. Now, what are we missing though? Well, for me, there always has to be a little punch of warmth, something a bit more sort of fun and happy in there. And here in this new palette of mine, we've got something really punchy, quinacridone coral, a real bright, bold pink, a bit more reddy perhaps than an opera pink, which people often use, but a real punch to it nonetheless. And that will hopefully just pair nicely with the red that I used in my Inktense pencil. And you can see just building up a tiny bit more warmth in those buildings to really draw them away from the greens and blues everywhere else. Keeping though loads of negative space. I don't want to lose that negative space, which I think in this is quite effective. And here, you know, I'm sure if you've seen my things before, I have a 5-step process, which is a flexible process. And normally you'd see me waiting for the paper to dry, and then I can add some little bold touches of watercolour on top. But because we're mixing our media, we're playing around with other things, instead I can bring back some watercolour pencil. And you notice how this just adds an instant kind of bold touch to what's going on. Don't have to do all the waiting around, and you can be really specific and really delicate about where you go. And now we're on to today, what's going to be the sort of combined last step. So like I say, normally a 5-step process. Normally I do some finishing touches at the end, and I'm still going to do that, but I'm going to put it all under what I normally call restructuring. So here, coming back with my ink, just refinding some of those key lines. And today's been a lot about the structure, hasn't it? A lot about those horizontals, a lot about those verticals, as well as the madness that is sort of underlying the style of line work that I really like producing. So first, we're getting back that structure with the ink. Try not to overdo things. We don't want to flatten this image. We don't want to sort of, you know, lose that really loose feel by now coming in with really bold marks. But we can also just introduce a little bit more clarity by doing this carefully. What I want to do next is to continue experimenting with mixed media. So as I'm jumping around here, I'm adding some bold black marks. I'm also thinking, where could I add highlights? Now with things like watercolour pencil, when you wash that will be transparent like watercolours, but when you add it on top, it's opaque because you're laying a sort of thick pigment on top. So it will feel very much closer to you than the transparent watercolours. You can tell these watercolours are transparent because you can see all the lines underneath them. However, with a watercolour pencil, before you wash it, you can very easily cover up those lines because it's opaque. That's even more true with a posca pen. So a posca pen, which is just a brand name, which has become synonymous with acrylic markers, a bit like calling a vacuum a Hoover. It's just a brand name for a vacuum. I'm going to use a few posca pens and a different kind of acrylic marker here with some white in. And you see how that white sits on top of the paint. And it's the same with the red lines I just put in. And if I added blue or orange, it could be nice ways of adding little highlights into our image, which will sit on top. Again, the disadvantage, you risk losing that transparency and that fluidity. So you need to be really careful and not overdo it. And just like that, I'm done. So if you enjoyed that, do like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think of my new palette, and I'll see you in the next video. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel, because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.